Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome our guests and members to this conversation today with Dr. Zoé Whitley on the occasion of Betye Saar's series Moonlight, and a special welcome to Zoé Whitley. Thank you so much for joining us today from London.
Well, Stephanie, I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. So I'll make it short. I just want to briefly introduce our guest for today. As director of Chisenhale Gallery, a leading nonprofit space founded by artists in London's East End, Dr. Zoé Whitley is responsible for the production and commissioning of new works of art by era-defining contemporary artists. Currently, there's a show on view by Rachel Jones, and exhibitions to Whitley's credit include also co-curating Elijah Pierce's America at the Barnes Foundation, the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2019, as well as many other shows. Zoé Whitley also writes widely on contemporary artists and serves on numerous international art prize juries. She's a trustee of Creative Access and the UAL Decolonising Arts Institute. Her prior roles include senior curator at the Hayward Gallery in London, as well as curator of international art at the Tate Modern, and curator of contemporary programs, Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And she was also the co-curator of the major touring exhibition Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power that originated at Tate Modern and that we're going to talk more about today. So we'll talk about the exhibition of Betye Saar at ICA that's currently still on view till April 17th, and subsequently traveling to the Frac Lorraine in Metz and the Kunstmuseum Lucerne in Switzerland. The exhibition brings together 8 installations of Saar, most of them from the 80s and 90s, many of which have not been shown in the last 30 years. And I had the chance to work closely with Betye Saar as well as her gallery and her studio to recreate these installations. And we're also right now in the process of finalizing the catalog for this exhibition that includes contributions by Sampara Aranke, Leah Allman, as well as Edwige Dantikat and myself. And
I'm looking forward to that. I don't want to interrupt you. But
no, please do.
No, Sam also wrote for our Elijah Pierce catalog. So that's going to be a really special treat for all of us to read that catalog when it's ready.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, that's exciting to hear. Yeah, it will be published this spring, so it's almost ready and going to print shortly. I would also like to thank all the supporters of the exhibition and the catalog that made this possible. The topic of our conversation today, Betye Saar, needs little to no introduction, so I'm going to make it very brief. Born in 1926 in Los Angeles, California, Betye Saar is a pioneer of West Coast assemblage art and Black feminism and has produced major works since the 1960s. Her works have been shown worldwide, really, including most recently the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Morgan Library, the Nasher in Dallas, as well as the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And her work is held in more than 60 museum collections, and she was also elected a member of the Academy of Arts and Letters in 2021. For this talk, if you have any questions, please feel free and welcome to add them in the chat, and we'll have the opportunity to do a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to dive in and welcome again, Zoé.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Stephanie. And I think we have so much in common because in both of our capacities, having worked with Betye as curators, we've had, I think, what is a very privileged opportunity to be able to recreate installations that existed elsewhere. So for all of the participants, wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We've compiled some slides. So I think if we move through those, I think we'll be able to relatively fluidly discuss both references and touch points that are very important to Betye, and then also to have Stephanie take us through what looks to be a particularly stunning exhibition. And I'm sorry I can't be there in the flesh. So it seemed apt to start with Simon Rodia's Watts Towers, because as Stephanie mentioned, Betye Saar is a California native. She lived for a time in Watts as a young child, but even once her family moved to a neighboring city of Pasadena in the Valley, she spent summers in Watts with her paternal grandmother. And I think that's important because what it left was a really indelible memory of passing Simon Rodia while he was building the Watts Towers. So before they had reached their kind of full pinnacle, their full exceptional glory that you see in this image here. And she describes herself as having been always a child with an incredibly full imagination who was drawn to fantastical things like fairy tales, but also magic, being very connected to a sense of clairvoyance. And so what she could see and what was being built really created extraordinary possibility. And because Rodia was using scrap iron and discarded steel for the structure, glass shards and cement, from these discards and otherwise unremarkable materials, it's where Betty credits how and where she first learned to be an artist.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And also adding to this, the technique of assemblage actually has this other layer and connection to Watts. In 1965, there happened the Watts Riots in the city, and actually in the aftermath of that, artist John Otterbridge and Noah Purify collected rubble from the streets and actually made this fascinating exhibition of assemblages that they had made from the scraps of the city, really, titled 66 Signs of Neon.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree. When we showed some of Betty's early assemblages at Tate Modern and then subsequently in the Soul of a Nation tour, that was precisely the juxtaposition to really create an understanding of an artistic milieu that was very much formed and shaped by the city around it and also by the social and civic precarity of that. And so I guess another point that may be interesting to mention that people may not be aware of is that while Betty studied design at UCLA, so this would have been between, I believe, 1947 and 49, with a specialism in interior design, she was also studying sociology. And her first job after graduating was as a social worker. So she also constantly had a sense of the people in a place. So I'm always particularly enthralled by her practice because it is so kind of resourceful, so spiritually connected, but it's also constantly grounded in an understanding of how people will experience a space and a place. And because at the time of her graduation, she was working with old age pensioners in particular, who were really on what was then called the breadline, or, often living at or below the poverty line and with incredibly little means. I think Betty's always had, even before we began using Kimberly Crenshaw's term intersectionality, a very complex sense of the number of ways in which people might be disadvantaged as a woman, as a Black person, but also as an older person that then becomes locked out of day-to-day interactions or involvement in the world around them. So I think it's that very particular way that Betty is so intuitively attuned to all stages of life is something that really, really resonates in the work for me.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, because I feel that connects also very directly to the installations, where she departed from the format of relatively intimately scaled wall-mounted assemblages into the space, and then actually the viewer herself or himself becomes really immersed into the work and is activating each of the installations and reacting to them. And it's really thinking about, even she talks about, for her, it's also really the showing the work and having people see it and react to it is really part for her of that work. And
so yes, this is one installation view from Betye Saar's solo exhibition at Cal State LA in 1973. So this is part of the installation that we recreated at Tate Modern. I'm working very closely with Betye to even create this kind of sfumato, that sort of cloudy trompe-l'oeil effect on that wall, using particular blue-gray paint. As you'll know, Betye has a phenomenal memory for things, and working from black and white images, we absolutely relied on Betty's sense and sensibility in order to accurately show the work, including these kind of stitched leather works. We also see a work here called There are a number of macrame works in this installation as well, and one of what became a number of works that were structured using found mirrors and windows.
And that is really also the first room size piece she did, as far as I can trace it back. But the first room size, really, like overall installation of her
Absolutely,
works.
definitely thinking of the works as a total experience rather than things to be viewed or experienced individually. Yeah.
And what is also, so these are made with paint on leather, right?
They are.
Suspended pieces. And for me, it's also interesting to see, which I think we'll see in the installations again, all the different motifs and forms and symbols that show up here. So the moon and the stars, the sun, the eye, which kind of really runs through her work from the early 60s till today, till she is making now.
Absolutely, a number of astrological symbols, symbols from palmistry charts and phrenology, signs and symbols, and thinking about how one might bring in the cosmos and belief systems of an entire world and bring them into a space. And that to me has always been fascinating, because Betye Saar saw the work of Joseph Cornell in 1967 at the Pasadena Museum of Art. And what she found were these kind of jewel-like worlds, almost like geodes, and thinking about how Cornell collected these materials. And Betty thereafter began making her own assemblages and would accumulate material that spoke to her and that, again, needed to in some way be incorporated into works of art. But I think, as we'll come on to, what's always fascinated me is that Joseph Cornell famously stayed in New York, but somehow created these worlds in these boxes. And I feel that Betty's always someone who then, particularly through her extensive travels worldwide, not only across Europe and Latin America, but also in the Caribbean, places like Haiti that have particular formation, Nigeria at a certain moment that we're kind of talking about in this period now, as well as throughout the African continent, and also thereafter in Asia, really is someone who takes the world and then is able to kind of harness its power in particular ways and then bring it into these smaller, more intimate spaces that then the rest of us can experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And also here with the wall-mounted pieces, you see this kind of strands of hair-like material, that I think there's this anecdote that her and David Hammonds went to the Field Museum together in Chicago in 73, and she saw this kind of overcoat from an African country that was
from Nigeria.
Shown, yeah, from Nigeria.
Told me that story. So yeah, they went to the museum together. And I think what's so important about that is that we often, I think, not only because of what at the time would have been the parameters of our roots into art, but also where and how it was accessed. I think anyone who's working with, say, macrame or painting on fabric, I think things might, or leather and textiles, could quite easily then be almost siloed within a realm of kind of craft or a particular kind of handmade tradition. And when David Hammons began working with hair at the same time, it was thought to be quite like a vanguard and radical act. But the fact that it had this same root or this same stem is something that I think is really important to be pulling out and thinking of. Also, so many of the ways in which Betye Saar is truly a vanguard thinker and maker in her approach to materials.
So this is which is I believe her very first altar form that she did as a freestanding sculpture that was part of the room we just saw, and which is now actually has been acquired for the Tate in London, which is so wonderful that it found a home there.
Yeah, it was acquired subsequently to Soul of a Nation. And I think that, again, as thinking about Betty's relationship to belief, but also to a kind of crossroads between life and death. And I think we'll also come to this in a number of the works that you've shown and curated for the ICA Miami exhibition, is really an incredibly life-affirming practice, but one where the specter of death is so often present. And again, not as something that has to be grim or macabre, but is actually a fact and a part of life. But even with MT, there's this way of making possible something that is living, that individuals who visit this show, in Betty's conception, if they're coming to MT, they can leave their own offerings, that it's meant to be something that is living and functions very much as an altar that has power and isn't sort of preserved as a kind of a hollow or lifeless sculpture, that there is a kind of life and an energy and a force within it.
Yeah, and I think that's also a gesture that she applies to multiple of her works. So in Miami at the ICA, we have the piece called Wings of Morning that actually has the function of an altar, and she invites people to leave offerings for people who've passed on and passed away. And it's this very interactive process where actually the offerings will eventually circle back to her, and she has the option to incorporate them in her works. Actually, thinking about the altar, I also wanted to bring up the topic of ritual, which was also an important chapter in the Soul of a Nation exhibition and the catalog, where there's actually a number of artists working in Los Angeles at that time in the late 60s, early 70s, or mid 70s that relate to ritual as a form of artistic practice. And that also includes David Hammons that you've just mentioned, and also artists like Senga Ngudi and Houston Conville that start thinking about ritual as an integral part of their practice, or even as the guiding principle of their practice.
I think that is absolutely true. I think that we certainly to our peril, I think, diminish the role of different forms of rites and rituals within systems of belief, and certainly within African diasporic practices. And I think that a number of artists have tapped into that in ways that are incredibly powerful and really important for us to be referencing and thinking about. And it's certainly something that's always had a resonance for Betye Saar. And then, as you say, rightly, a number of her colleagues who were active in and around the Brockman Gallery in Los Angeles. And that as a radical form of making, but understanding art as something that has a truly transcendent power is very important.
Yeah, and in that regard, it's also interesting that Betty is actually someone who actively starts framing her own art making as ritual. She opens a show in 1980 at the Studio Museum in Harlem that's called Rituals. And actually in the book, I just took a few notes earlier, she says, well, for me, my making is a ritual process, and it actually has 4 very distinct steps, which start from the imprint of memories, experiences, ideas, to the search, where she finds objects like this table that creates the basis for Umti is actually made of palm fronds, and she acquired it in Los Angeles. So she finds these objects that already have a history, and then the process as a third step of recycling and transformation sets in. So painting the pieces, gluing them together, manipulating the materials. And then lastly, what we had also already mentioned in terms of the installations, the release is a big part, meaning the work is exhibited and actually received by audiences, and they start interacting.
And I think that's such an important part of one of the major motifs that we will come to in works that you've shown. And that has so much to do with this sense of reconciling the displacement that's taken place across the African diaspora as a result of, the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, and where these forms of faith and ritual and belief can create these different pathways for connection. Because even as you mentioned, I was just thinking of the filmmaker Barbara McCullough, who another work that was created in Los Angeles in 1979 and was literally called an urban rite of purification. That's a water ritual, and took place within this site between, what was soon to be a kind of much more built up area, but thinking about these connections between urban blight, but the possibility for renewal and creativity within those spaces, I think is really vital, and maybe can help push our thinking through some of the other works that we'll be looking at. So yes, this is Black Girl's Window. So certainly a very formative work in the pantheon of Betty's extraordinary oeuvre that's, spans 8 decades, or even more than that, really, because I remember seeing her exhibition in Scottsdale, Arizona, which started with an image that she'd made as a very young girl. So really, I think it's fair to say that Betty's been an artist her whole life. But it really does, given this date, 1969, speak to the continuity of mystical content in the work. So we see these crescent moons and stars. There are phrenology charts. There's the skeleton, so that ever-present or often present specter of death. That the fact that there are these astrological signs commingling with these other symbols really does speak to this kind of mystical connection, and this shadow figure. And again, we'll come to Stephanie's installation of some really powerful shadow works that were made more recently. That's at the center of Black Girl's Window. In the lower portion of this pane is actually a self-portrait of Betye Saar. And you see the astrological symbols again, kind of on the artist's raised hands. And I think that this is a kind of a really powerful statement of a number of places that the work goes to. And even looking at the kind of the inbuilt grid of this found object, I think Stephanie will see, relates very much to the recurring motif of the ladder, and of many other signs and symbols that, we see consistently throughout a kind of 70, 80-year practice.
Yeah, and I think it's also a great example how Betty really densely weaves together spiritual references, historical and social reference, but also a lot of autobiographical references. So there's always this very personal access, which I think makes the work so powerful, because they are very accessible through this autobiographical level, but then lead to so many more complex themes of spirituality and diaspora, and kind of, that's for me the portal into many of these works.
Wonderful. I agree.
So if we go to the next slide, that's the first installation view that we also see behind me here. And we have, as I mentioned in the beginning, 8 installations gathered. We created these intimate spaces, because when I started the dialogue with Betty almost 3 years ago, she said what was most important to her is really the experience is intimate. And I actually heard you talking about it, Zoe, in a podcast of how the different colors in all these rooms really kind of add to this experience of being immersed and really entering like a different experience, almost a different world in each of these rooms. And maybe we just hop into the first room. So all of them are kind of colored in different colors inside.
And I love this motif kind of on the train of the wedding dress, of seeing this flotilla of ships. And, you know, as you brought to my attention, the cast shadow of each being the schematic of the slave ship Brooks, and the sea is again, and again, the kind of the very powerful connection that water has in Betty's work, I think is incredibly important, not only in relation to the middle passage, but also as an autobiographical reference. And I love this quote that she'd given in a Frieze article, where she says, "When I think of the sea of my life, I'm not a strong swimmer. I never had the stroke for the mainstream, but the flotsam and jetsam of tides is what I make my art form. I recycle things that I find, not only materials, images, and objects, but feelings and ideas. I put them together and they turn into an object, collage, assemblage, or installation." And so I think that there's something powerful about this kind of the sea roiling, or, you know, the souls of those who were cast overboard still kind of informing and inflecting and kind of powering the work in particular ways. Would you like to take us into some of the rooms?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think we might just enter the first room, or for me it's kind of the first room, which is House of Fortune, which is one of her installations that she actually, we see it here, the entrance on the left. So we'll move slowly in here. Perfect. And House of Fortune is actually an installation Betty made in 1988 for her Southeast Asia exhibition tour that she was invited for by the United States Information Agency, which was a federal agency that no longer exists, but that invited American artists to bring American arts and culture to other parts of the world. So in this case, the tour was in Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, and also in New Zealand. And Betty made this work that's actually consists of silk banners, paper pulp works, sequin pieces, and this ensemble of folding chairs and tables. And all the pieces have very different history. And this is actually the first time, I believe, since it was shown in Malaysia, that all these objects are together in a room again. So if we go on to the next detail, we see the folding chair and table that she actually acquired at the Rose Bowl Flea Market in Pasadena, which is one of the many places where she would regularly go and find pieces that would inspire her for new works. And she actually manipulated this piece with her own handprints that kind of evoke this seance-like setting. But then there's also runes burned in, and we can see on the right leg of the table the Damballa symbol for the Haitian deity Damballa, that is the snake. And we see tarot cards spread in the palm fronds. And you just mentioned her show in Scottsdale, where actually this table and chairs were also shown. However, they were set in tumbleweed. Yeah. So here in Miami, we have palm fronds. And I think in Malaysia, she said there was a big storm when she was installing, and on the streets were all these twigs and wood, so she started collecting them to actually create this like local connection of the piece.
Wow.
Here we see the tarot cards. So there's all these different strategies or techniques almost to kind of engage with fortune and trying to figure out what the future is. And there's another quote of hers where she says basically what all these religious and spiritual practices have in common is we're trying to figure out where we belong and where we're going, which I think is very beautiful. And these silk banners, these are 3 of them, and actually the 4th one is, oh, physically speaking, behind us, yes, there. So it's the 4 elements. There's a pyramid of water, the circle of fire, the tower of earth, and the puffs of air for the wind. And then straight on, we see a collection of sequin pieces that she actually had made in collaboration with Haitian sequin artists. So as you mentioned, she traveled to Haiti in 73. She received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. And she said she applied for the grant because specifically she asked to go to Haiti because for her, that was a place where spiritualism and the ritual practice are so enmeshed into everyday life, and it's really part of life. It's not something separate, but the practice of voodoo really guides the culture there in a day-to-day life and how you lead your life. So she asked these sequin makers to actually use her symbols, and we see again the celestial bodies, the palm tree chart that you had mentioned, the fish jumping through the fan, and made these irregularly shaped sequin flags that initially came up as forms to adorn voodoo temples. So a lot of different forms flow together here. And there's also the piece at the center has this kind of Japanese little like pocket almost to put a notebook. And some of the fabric almost looks like Indian. So a lot of these different influences you mentioned really come together in this piece.
Yeah, and I think what you'd said, that kind of that way that Betye is perpetually capable of taking in very reverential and respectful ways a range of different belief systems, but really to kind of condense them to their essence of, you know, the things that we're all seeking, you know, as human beings, and to see these forms of faith and the different expressions thereof as ultimately things that can connect rather than divide us. I think I've always found incredibly powerful when you're kind of standing in the space and there with the work. So to see this adaptation of the Haitian Voodoo flags tradition and to see it taken in this way that then becomes something that's very much in Betye Saar's own language is really, really like incredibly intriguing to me.
Yeah, and she talks herself about how her goal is to make them as universal as possible. It's not being specifically Santeria or specifically voodoo, but to kind of take these aspects and really bring them together to something new that is an open portal, so to say, for everybody to kind of enter from different angles.
Yeah.
So maybe we can go to the next piece in the show, which is Wings of Morning that I previously mentioned. Here it's actually photographed at quite an early stage in the show. Now, after almost 4 months, the offerings that we see here spread across the bottom have grown substantially. And it's really beautiful to see what people leave. And also it has this kind of, the panel was originally actually shaped for a museum, the African American Museum in Boston, where it was first shown, and it was fitted underneath a stairwell in this beautiful old architecture. And then subsequently, similar to House of Fortune, Betye adds like locally sourced trees and twigs. So these also change. I know it has been shown, I believe, in the Netherlands, where we just see birch trees, and here's local trees from Miami. And she made the piece after her mother passed away. So the invitation is to leave offerings for those who've passed away.
And that's what I think there's a really beautiful double meaning here, you know, as the kind of mourning as in like the dawn of a new day, but also mourning as in this kind of grieving, mourning with a U. And to think about how that's kind of so poetically something here that's offered as a collective process, and also something that is a universal feeling. And equally, it's interesting thinking now of a motif that I know will recur with, I think the next work that you'll be talking us through is this sense of Betty's work also having, being these kind of living, breathing things. So you spoke about the adaptation of the different forms of, whether it's palm fronds or Arizona tumbleweeds, those sorts of things, or, Malaysian branches. And then here being able to recreate something where it still retains its essence each time it's recreated, and that actually gives the work a new life, rather than something having been preserved in such a static way that it's almost embalmed. I feel that the works always have this kind of slightly evolutionary quality, or something that just allows them to have very much a life of their own.
Yeah, definitely. And if we go to the next work, I mean, that's a great point you're making. And so many of the installations, I mean, in researching them through Betty's incredible archive, really absolutely unique, and all the detailed notes and records she has kept over all these decades, it really made this installation the whole exhibition possible, to be able to go back and also talk to her and see how she made these works. I realized how many of these objects keep reappearing in different installations, and as you say, they keep evolving and shifting, and it's almost like a pool of props she uses that then she kind of uses to or it's like vocabulary, and she like constantly reformulates new contexts out of them. So
Vocabulary, I think, is definitely what I would call it. I think that she has such a singular language, and there's a kind of a lexicon within that she can draw upon. And we see that with the kind of the star chart and the celestial universe behind on the wall, behind on the slide we're seeing. Again, the slave ship brooks, again, these raised hands that could be raised in supplication or in prayer. Also this kind of path of self-discovery, because we also saw the raised hands and the exposed palms in Black Girl's Window, and that was 1969. So then to see this again in a work from as recent as 2019, you really begin to see the continuity in the practice, but the way in which Betty's able to constantly reinvent each of these symbols.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's also important to emphasize that while the installations were really, she did the majority of them in the 80s and 90s, it's not the way that it's like, oh, there's a period of assemblage, then there's a period of installations, and then there's a period of silk paintings, but it all happens parallel and continuously. And even before Black Girl Window, when she worked in print and printmaking and did all these beautiful prints that were shown at MoMA, you see the same images and the same language, as you say, the same vocabulary, and that just keeps running through all of these works. Incredible. It's very consistent, but the time, the lexicon she develops is so flexible that allows her to make so many different works that yet have so much in common. So yeah, this piece is from 2019, but actually the boat is a motif that appears in a lot of her installations from the 90s. And as she reuses so many of these objects, it's really, it's kind of migratory. It's not that you can like recreate it one-on-one. And I believe she made roughly 40 different versions of installations over these 20 years, and yet was using all these different objects in different forms. There are maybe 15 you could show in parallel.
Wow. I think that's It's a wonderful thing to see, and I think gives so many more inroads into the practice to see, some of it could be just an evolution on a theme, and to see how one symbol just keeps being reworked, and keeps growing and changing, but is still recognizable fundamentally. So.
Yeah, and maybe we just glance briefly at the next installation in the interest of time. Let's see, this one is Oasis, that was initially made for a show in Los Angeles at MoCA Temporary Contemporary in '84, and it's this little chair with 21 birthday candles and rosebuds on the seat. So, which speaks to youth and this kind of transitory moment of growing up. But maybe we just hop to the next installation, which is called Shadow Song, which is nice to see as going back also again to Black Girl's Window and the shadow silhouette, but also the autobiographical, because these are all based on photographs Betye took of her own shadow in different locations. In the 80s and 90s, she was teaching a lot, and she traveled a lot. So we see her here in different locations, in a pool in Pasadena on the left in the blue piece. And then here in the front, Skowhegan, Maine, where she was a visiting artist in a very accomplished residency program.
And what I love about that too is that, throughout Betty's really incomparable career, there's always been this connection to other artists. I know we've named only a few in the course of our time together, but to think of Skowhegan as a place where artists of really exceptional promise go to connect with others and to be part of, a bigger community, that Betty has always been not only an artist practitioner, but also a teacher and a sharer of her ideas and worldview, and someone who is then equally receptive to receiving that from other artists as well.
Yeah, and so continuing the thought of teaching, she was then for the next installation invited actually to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, to make work there within the computer department, the computer program, and artists were actually encouraged to connect to the students and also to the topic of technology that Betty took quite literally in terms of hardware. And she uses all these computer parts together with other found objects to make this large scale assemblage, really, that's kind of a shape for me between a cityscape, but also an altar, if we look at the next detail. And she uses actually a lot of copper, these copper plates. And then there's these little squiggles, Betty calls them, on the wall, which are actually copper cables. And one of our visitors actually told me that in a lot of shamanistic practices, copper is really important because it's a conductor in every sense of the word. It's a perfect conductor for electricity, but also energy in a more spiritual understanding.
It also kind of formally or structurally takes me back in some ways to the Watts Towers, to your point about the cityscape. And again, I think that there's something about this work that I found so refreshing and surprising, because it again resists the sense that by being interested in the handmade or in reusing found objects, that there's any necessary distance between an interest in technology. Oh, there we have another little skeleton embedded in the work. So again, we have this kind of the promise of technology, but also death being ever present.
Yeah, and Betty made this little, what she calls it, a silent radio, this running LED sign that kind of inspired the title for the piece. I got my mojo working, and the second line is, I'm going to use it on you, which is from a 1960s blues song. But she really draws this parallel between technology and mojo. And well, before we started, we briefly also talked about mojo as like well, an amulet or a charm.
Yeah, any kind of, I think that talismanic power, there's so much kind of contained in that word. And, you know, there's mojo sauce. And I was saying to you that Betty has a fantastic little dog named Miss Mojo. So, you know, this way of thinking about something like big and spiritual and uncontainable, but that it could also have these kind of other much more relatable references, you know, whether it's a song lyric or, you know, something you could eat, or, you know, the little canine companion that you live with. So I think that to me is just kind of Betty at her best, you know, that kind of that wit, that intuition, that way of constantly being able to rework something, but to make it new every time.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. So maybe before we start our Q&A, and for viewers, please feel free to add questions. We can look at the last installation of the show, which is called the Trickster. And we have the Trickster figure here to our left, this antique oven that's kind of anthropomorphized. Actually, it's hard to see in the photo, but there are these little details that really emphasize the trickster as the messenger figure between life and death, but also between humans and gods. And it has actually a little key earring on one of its side, and a little bell at, well, this could be an angle. And we see the female side here in the front, and it has a back side, which is a male side. So it can shift, but Betty had specified that she wanted to face the female side to the visitors. And we have the motif of the hands here again too.
Yeah.
And I wanted to maybe see, it also includes a quote on one of the walls. It's kind of finger painted. It says, "Hoodoo's a blade that cuts both ways." And here we have the spirit door that's also kind of this semi-permeable like mesh in the middle, and is actually also two-sided. So this idea of two spheres are being transitioning from one side to the other is interesting. And the quote is actually from Zora Neale Hurston, who Betty references quite a bit in her works, actually. And I was wondering if you could speak more to that.
Yes, I think that looking at this, you know, this spirit door, you know, the taking of a screen door, you know, something that helps the air get in, but hopefully, you know, keep the flies out, or that sort of thing, to think about that as this kind of permeable portal between worlds is really, again, such an ingenious way to think about repurposing the objet trouvé, like the found object, and to turn it into something that is then able to materially reference and contain so many of the themes being explored. But what I was saying to you was that I was particularly excited about Betye Saar's work and her relationship to Hurston, because both Betye Saar and Alice Walker and are so important as Black women artists who helped to kind of effectively excavate the memory and the oeuvre of Zora Neale Hurston. And so I think there's also something important not to be lost in recognizing the role that Black women have in terms of supporting and telling the stories of other Black women. And that's also something that's happened throughout Betty's career, when she was also organizing exhibitions in Los Angeles and creating space for other Black women to have their work shown. So for me, that kind of felt like a sort of a full circle way of understanding a relationship to text, to history, and then to how those things might then be made manifest in the gallery space, or in the art space that we can then see and understand, or then be able to refer back to.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a great point to maybe start the questions. And thinking of her, well, we mentioned her briefly as a teacher, and I mean, I think that her influence in that way is also so incredibly important. She taught at UCLA and then also at Otis Parsons. and among her students was Carrie James Marshall. And I think just how different her students' works came out, as Ulysses Jenkins too, the videographer who just has a show at the Hammer Museum. And these like extremely different forms of work, I feel, speak to her really as a incredibly good teacher, where she just enables all these very different forms that came out of her students' work.
Absolutely. Do our participants have any questions? We're happy to answer.
Maybe as we're waiting for questions, I take the opportunity and ask my own question. Because I was actually curious on a more personal level on how you first came across Betty's work. I believe you also grew up in Los Angeles.
I did. So that's a good question. It's one of those things. It's like it's always been there. I think I probably first came across Betty's work in a book. So probably not having seen it kind of physically until after I'd encountered it, reproduced in a book. I was lucky to go to a high school where we were also learning art history and studying studio art while we were learning the kind of standard high school curriculum. And my art teacher at the time, Marianne Hall, knew that I was interested in learning more about Black artists in particular, and so would bring books in so that I could look. So that's certainly the gateway. So I do think that beautifully illustrated art books, are an important way to connect people to the work. And then, I just something that had kind of it always fascinated me.
And then, yeah.
Oh, we have a question from Susan Galler. Did Betty see the exhibition at the ICA?
She did. She was actually here 2 weeks ago, and she was so excited to see these works come back to life because, as I mentioned in the beginning, many of them had not been shown since the 80s and 90s. So it was also a very special moment for her, and she was very involved with the planning of the show. As I mentioned, really the floor plan and this like very specific layout with the rooms was her idea to really create this immersive experience. So yeah, she saw the show and has been very involved. And actually also for those who join in from Miami, if you have a chance, actually the Martin Luther King Metro Rail station just northwest of ICA is a Betye Saar installation that she was commissioned to do in 1988.
Oh, wow.
So it's still there. She went to visit also when she was in Miami. And the Art in Publics program asked a lot of national artists at that time to make a specific project for these Metro Rail stops. And her piece is actually called On Our Way. And it also uses the shadow silhouette. However, in this case, not her own, but she worked with the residents around the station and drew their shadow silhouettes that are then mounted in enamel and metal all over the escalators and walls of the station.
Wow. And the next question, which may need to be our final one, does relate also from Maria Lino, who asks, does Betty also design the lighting for her installations, especially the gliding into midnight? It's stunning and really enhances the work.
Yes, she does. So this is a fairly new work, and it has this iridescent blue light that illuminates the piece, and what doesn't come across as powerful in the photographs, but the hands are actually surrounded by coal. Not charcoal, but actual coal. So it has this like minerally glitter that kind of captures these lights. And it's really like a midnight experience in that way. Well, Zoe, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and all these beautiful insights into Betty's work. It's really been a pleasure and an honor.
Oh, it's been absolutely my pleasure. So thank you everyone for joining, and a hi to Julie. So yes, it's been wonderful to be here. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I know that we all share our thanks to Betty for such powerful work.
Totally. Yeah, I can only agree on that. And thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
Right. Goodbye.